So today I would like to talk about a very interesting way of determining the dating on a watch. And this is primarily a somewhat little known technique that one uses with relation to the dial and how it is decorated. Now, originally, watch dials were painted by hand. And this hand painting did go out of fashion for other techniques, including various chemical processes and photographic processes. And we find that from 1884, this is December 30th of 1884, we do find a mention of a collodion process for making watch dials. Now, this was patented on December 30th, 1884. This was by Henry Abbott, who was working with Elgin watches. And so this is the end of 1884. We're basically speaking of 1885 forward, and more or less between the period of 1885 to 1890, we have both this process of applying colors to enamel dials for watches and clocks, which we see here, and a secondary, this is a powder process, which we find basically coming into fruition by the early 1890s, right around 1890. And the Keystone magazine does mention this very detailed in an 1897 article. And this so-called powder process allowed for photographic images to be placed on enamel dials. So this is a so-called photographic process. But this will help us in dating watches. Now, when we're speaking of Swiss watches, it must be remembered that this technology did take a little bit of time to materialize in Switzerland. Before this was basically developed in the United States, and the very first appearance of any such technology in Switzerland we find in Davoine almanacs from 1892. This is the very first mention under Cadran Metal. We find in Alphonse Collin Photographie et Enamel, and he was at in La Chaux-de-Fonds at Rue Demoiselle, number 56. So he appears to be the original trailblazer who established this in Switzerland. We find no earlier mentions in Davoine almanacs. So this is quite fascinating. And within 2 years, we see the earliest of these pioneers in this field. We find one of these is we do find Ariste Montandon Calam, and we find him making these. He was a specialist in making cadran, or dials, watch dials, and we find him advertising or known for Procédé Photographique, and he was located at Rue du Nord, number 113. So Ariste Montandon was one of the original innovators in this field of the photographic process. Now, this would not be widespread even in 1892. This is the beginning. 1892, 1894, we only have 2 individuals who are even mentioned in Davoine. We do find in 1894 that Alphonse has a very nice Alphonse Collin, number 56, Rue de la Demoiselle, cadran métallique en tout genre, dorure, argenture, spécialité de dorage en couleur sur fond de boîte, et mot photographique sur cadran émail. So this is very interesting. And portrait émail. So he was already making this, and this process would later be known as photograveur. And we find him in 1894 in Geneva, or rather, he is joined by, in 1884, Geneva, newcomer to this photogravure, and this is Monsieur A. Chevalet in Geneva at Rue du Mont Blanc, number 6. And we find him advertising reproduction soignée pour l'horlogerie, la bijouterie, la joaillerie, photographie, phototypie. So he was executing these photographic processes, which was a chemical powdered application to induce these images. But these three individuals were the very first in Switzerland to be doing this. And even by 1898, we see many advertisements in the Davoine almanacs, where we still see dozens of peintres en cadran, so and peintres sur émail. So the bulk of watches up until around 1900, Swiss watches, are still being produced with painted dials. And so it would not be until probably around after 1900 before this started to become much more widespread. Even by 1918, we still find, and it would have been certainly by this point, the photographic and printed dials would have been much greater by this point. But we still do find a thriving community of artisans who still are painting the dials and decorating dials and such. So the art was not lost even 2 decades into the 20th century. So, but this is of great use in attempting to date watches. Now, of course, the Americans were advanced in this field, and American watches, we can see this 1885-1890 period where this was all evolving, that they were very able to quickly introduce this on a large scale. And so with this on the Swiss watch production side, we are not seeing this until certainly after 1900. However, this before then, this would have been the exception, not the rule. You know, after 1900, clearly we have the steam has built, the processes are in place, and we are finding less and less of the painted dials. However, up until the First World War, we are observing numerous watches still with painted dials. This is rather fascinating, but I would like to show you some examples of Swiss watches where we can see this now. Let us continue with the watches. So now we are proceeding to analyze the watch dials. Now, previously I had promised to show my larger collection, and so here we have the bulk of my collection, and this is not a complete sample. However, this gives one an idea. Now, I would like to discuss the watches from various different periods. Now, I will be providing close-ups of the watch dials for illustration. Now, the earliest piece that I have is dating from probably the mid-1780s to no later than 1789, in this period 1790, and this is clearly a painted dial on this Quantium. This is a calendar watch, and one of the giveaways about hand-painted dials versus photographic images or other chemical processes for transferring the watch dial elements. One of the giveaways is, and this is very little discussed, very little information about this to my knowledge, but we do find various different telltale signs that the watch dial has been painted. And this can be the inflection of the artist's strokes on the numbers, or various other defects where we can see that the lines have not exactly been observed. But anyways, this is more or less some of the signs. Now this is clearly a painted dial. Let us move on to, and we do have a similar, this is a dial, Aufin et Montandon, from Clermont, and this is also in the same period. This is roughly 1790 to 1800. Again, a painted dial. We have the Arabic numerals, which in this period were more prevalent. Now, moving on, we would like to move into the middle of the 19th century. Now, I have a series of movements, these are generally pieces from that period of roughly the 1860-1880 period, perhaps as a stretch of a maximum 1885, late 1880s. Now, certain of these watches are very, give various different, I will provide a close-up, but this is going to provide a little bit of idea. Now, this El Montandon Locla, this is clearly a hand-painted dial, and we can see this in the irregularity of the dots around the these demarcations around the dial. And other telltale hints are, for example, when we see the thinner strokes on the Roman numerals, that these thinner, that in certain cases they can almost appear to be non-existent or very delicate. These are hand painted. In these chemical processes, these Roman numerals are much thicker. So this is another giveaway. But also we can see in some cases trace lines. So here we're clearly dealing with painting. This also helps us to establish a dating for the piece. Now, as we progress through the 19th century and we find ourselves approaching late 1880s to 1890, now we are able to glean information. Now we do have, for example, this is a Montandon Locla chronograph movement, and now this is a Alfred Lugran movement, and this particular movement was patented by Lugran in 1889. Therefore, this watch can be no younger or no earlier than this 1889 date, and this gives us a little bit of a clue. However, when we examine the watch dial itself, even at this late stage, and we're probably talking easily the 1890s, possibly up until 1900, when we examine this under the lens, we do find that, again, this is quite well done, yet one almost needs a microscope to determine, because with the help of a microscope, one can analyze the distribution of the ink where it exists, and we can see a very big difference between hand-painted dials and these processes of photographic or chemical, this collodion process. Now this does appear still to be a painted dial, even at this late stage. So once again, the Swiss took more time to implement this technique than was known in the American market. This is also clear when we look at this Albert Montandon Genève piece. Now this is clearly at least 1870s. It may have been a little later. The movement in this is a Jules Jurgensen style movement, and now this movement did have a longevity. It could be later than 1870, but this is probably in this period. And once again, we have a painted dial, and it can be noticed in the small irregularities on the dial surface. So we have these clues that help us to aid in the dating. Another fascinating piece Now this is a metal dial. Now clearly all these metal dials are always hand painted. So even this is most likely during this 1875 to 1885 period. So this this technology is not as clear, but clearly it would have been before these processes had come in, since this metallic dial was still in vogue at that time. So this is rather fascinating with regards to dating the object. Now, I would like to show watches that we do find in this 1890 to early 20th century period. And one such example, this is very fascinating. This is a Montandon Geneva piece, and it's almost shaped like a travel clock. This was rather popular around 1900. And now this dial is clearly painted when one analyzes this up close. And there are small defects, and we also see there are the remnants of an inner series of Arabic numerals as opposed to the Roman numerals, which have mainly faded, but this red, we can still see the remnants of this. This is clearly a painted dial with a painted additional inner, and this may have been used in railroad applications. This was actually acquired from France, and it has a stamp on it from in a drugstore in Besançon. This is rather interesting, but this is probably between the 1800 to 1914 period. So this is an interesting object. Now we also have certain other watches. Now these are Swiss watches that were made for the English market. And this was Montjean and Montandon, and they were signing in Birmingham. They were Swiss watches made in La Chaux-de-Fonds and exported to England, and they had their store there, the two partners. The dial, this is the early 1880s, and this dial is clearly painted still. So they hadn't, once again, they hadn't gone on to this newer technique in the dial production. Another interesting piece is this Télémètre Montandon. This is a telemetric device for artillery fire. It's also a doctor's watch. Now this has a Poinçon, a maker's mark, which was registered in 1887. And so this company that was producing this did sell off all their assets to another company at the death of the owner in 1890. So this piece is clearly in the 1887 to 1890 period. But once again, we find in the very close details of this dial, it does appear to be, once again, a painted dial. Now, we do have a very interesting chronometer champion who made this watch. This dial is signed U. Montandon Robert, Geneva. And this watch, now this is probably one of his earlier pieces. This is clearly from this 1890 to circa 1914 period. This very popular style of case decoration was prevalent around 1900, and this does appear to be from this area of this period. Now, this dial is done rather well, but this is very difficult to tell without the aid of a microscope. However, we are approaching this period where these processes were responsible for the dial production and not hand painting. So this is just giving us a little bit of a foundation or basis for determining the dating on these watches. Other watches we have, I would like to show, we do have another dial by U. Montandon. This is Eulis Montandon Robert. And this is, once again, this does appear to be from the same period. This is the circa probably late 1890s, but certainly before World War I. And this does, once again, appear to be a painted dial. And it is the details, these slight deviations in the numbers that may be helping us here. This is not exactly clear. One really does need, for this period after 1900, one really does need a microscope to be absolutely sure in many cases, because the arts had been so refined that this can be rather borderline, that are from the 1930s, where this is clearly already not hand painted, but rather these are processes. Now these are metallic dials, and metallic dials may be painted to a certain extent, but clearly the process was totally different than the hand painted enamel, which we spoke of at the beginning. So once again, it should be remembered when we're discussing American watches versus Swiss watches that clearly Americans had a head start in this whole technological revolution with dial decoration and painting, yet the Swiss were able to catch up, and we do find them implementing this certainly by 1892, but also this was in La Chaux-de-Fonds, where the watch industry had moved from Le Locle to fundamentally La Chaux-de-Fonds, but also Geneva. And 1892 and 1894, we already see multiple instances of these processes being offered, including Ariste Montandon Colin and the other pioneers in this field. But this was just a little bit of a aid in dating watches based on painted dial versus these chemical and photographic procedures, which it can be helpful in trying to determine the age of a watch. It is an interesting topic. It is not as well discussed. There are other techniques for determining a watch's age. However, this is one that is seldom quoted or cited, mainly due to the fact of when we have these borderline cases, it is almost incumbent to have a microscope at hand so that one can look at the distribution of the paint on the dial and see, is this more densely representative in the numerals, which would indicate the newer technology, or is this more scattered, which would represent an artisan's brush strokes. So this was just a little bit of a note for the record and demonstration on this dating technique. I hope it was interesting, and I thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.